there was ever an Anthrax album that deserved a second chance, it's Stomp 442, because this wasn't just another record, it was an album made while the band was falling apart. One of their most important members had just walked away, they didn't even have a permanent lead guitarist, the music world had completely changed, and Anthrax suddenly found themselves trying to prove they still mattered in the middle of the alternative rock explosion, and somehow they still managed to make one of the heaviest albums of their career. But it was also an album surrounded by bad timing, controversy, label problems, and enough behind-the-scenes drama to sink almost any band. Today we're taking a look into the story behind Stomp 442, an album that many fans ignored in 1995, but has slowly earned a loyal following over the years. Let's get into it. Following the success of Sound of White Noise, Anthrax looked like they pulled off the impossible. When Joey Bello left the band in 1992, plenty of fans thought it was the end. Replacing a singer with such a recognizable voice is never easy. But John Bush stepped in and immediately made an impact. Sound of White Noise debuted at number 7 on the Billboard charts, became one of the band's highest charting albums, and proved that Anthrax could survive in the post-thrash era. For a moment, everything looked promising. But behind the scenes, things weren't nearly as stable as they appeared. Longtime lead guitarist Dan Spitz had reached a breaking point. After years of relentless touring, he was simply burned out. Imagine spending most of your life on buses and airports, hotels, repeating the same cycle over and over again. Dan had been living that life since he was a teenager, and by the mid-90s, he'd have enough. There were personal reasons too. He had started a family and realized he didn't want to spend months at a time away from his children. Even more surprising, he admitted that he lost his passion for playing guitar altogether. There wasn't some huge fight or dramatic falling out with the band. He simply didn't want that lifestyle anymore. So in 1995, Dan Spitz walked away from Anthrax and became a Swiss watchmaker. And yes, you heard that right. He went from being the lead guitarist to being a Swiss watchmaker. But don't worry, he will eventually attempt to come back, and he will make another album. I'll talk about that in a future episode. Now, without a lead guitarist, you would think they would hold auditions for a replacement, but they didn't. Instead, they decided to move forward without one. A risky decision for any metal band. You still need guitar solos, you need harmonies, you still need someone to fill that role somehow. So for the recording of Stomp 442, Anthrax became something of an unusual operation. Scott Ian remained the band's riff machine as always, while drummer Charlie Benante stepped in and played a surprising amount of rhythm guitar during the recording sessions. Charlie had always been much more than just a drummer. He writes riffs, arrangements, melodies, and during these sessions, he became an even bigger creative force. The band headed to Studio 4 in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And working alongside producers Phil and Joe Nicolo, the Butcher Brothers. Now, it was an interesting pairing. The Butcher Brothers weren't known primarily for producing thrash metal. Their backgrounds included alternative rock, hip-hop, and modern rock productions. That influence helped shape Stomp 442 into something that sounded heavier, thicker, and groove-oriented without completely abandoning Anthrax's identity. This wasn't a band trying to recreate Among the Living. It wasn't even trying to recreate Sound of White Noise. Instead, Anthrax leaned into a darker, more muscular sound. The riffs became slower, the grooves got deeper, John Bush's vocals sounded even grittier. Rather than chasing speed, they chased weight. Of course, that still led to one major problem: who's going to play all the guitar solos? Instead of bringing in one replacement, Anthrax assembled a rotating cast of guitar players. Paul Crook handled much of the lead guitar work on several tracks and would eventually become their touring guitarist. Mike Tempesta contributed leads as well, while Zach Throne stepped in to play solo on Anthrax's cover of Husker Du's Celebrated Summer. But then there was the biggest guest appearance of them all, Dimebag Darrell. In 1995, Pantera had become one of the biggest metal bands on the planet, and Dimebag was widely considered one of the greatest guitarists alive. Fortunately for Anthrax, he was also one of their closest friends. Dimebag came into the studio simply because he wanted to help. He played the blistering solos on King Size and Riding Shotgun, adding his unmistakable style to two of the album's heaviest songs. And here's one of my favorite stories from these sessions. Anthrax wanted to pay him, Dimebag refused. He wasn't doing it for the money, so eventually the band asked, "Well, what do you want?" His answer, a really expensive video camera, and that was it. Instead of taking cash, Dimebag asked for one of the best video cameras available at the time, and Anthrax happily bought it for him. That story tells you everything you need to know about Dimebag. It wasn't business, it was friendship. Despite the revolving door of guitar players, Stomp 442 never sounds like a patchwork record. If anything, it's remarkably cohesive. Songs like Fueled and random acts of senseless violence show that Anthrax could still write crushing modern metal without abandoning memorable hooks. King Size became one of the heaviest songs they ever recorded. Nothing slowed down things enough to create enormous groove. And then it was perhaps the biggest surprise in the entire album, Bear, a full-on acoustic ballad. If you had told an Anthrax fan in 1987 that one day they would record an acoustic song, they probably would have laughed you out the room. Yet here it was. Some fans appreciated the willingness to experiment. Others absolutely hated it. And that's really the story of Stomp 442 as a whole. Anthrax weren't interested in repeating themselves. They weren't trying to make Persistence of Time Part 2. They were writing music that felt right in 1995. If the music on Stomp 442 wasn't controversial enough, Anthrax managed to stir up even more attention before everyone had dropped the needle on the album. And surprisingly, had nothing to do with the songs. It was the cover. Now, if you ever looked at Stomp 442, you know it's one of the strangest album covers in Anthrax's entire catalog. A giant sphere made from crushed cars sits in the middle of a barren landscape while completely a naked man stands beside it. It's exactly the kind of artwork that makes you stop and look and ask, what am I looking at? The cover was designed by the legendary Storm Thurgeson, the man behind some of rock's most iconic album covers. This was the same creative genius responsible for Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, The Division Bell, and many others. Thorgerson hated relying on digital effects for digital manipulation. If he imagined something impossible, his first instinct wasn't to fake it with computers, it was to figure out how to build it in real life. That's exactly what happened here. Contrary to what many people assume, the giant ball of crushed cars wasn't created with Photoshop. It actually existed, or it did, partially. Building an entire giant sphere of the size Thorgerson envisioned would have been nearly impossible, so his team came up with a clever solution. They built 1/4 of the massive scrap metal ball using real crushed cars, suspended it from a huge industrial crane, photographed it, rotated it, photographed again, and then repeated the process until the images represented all four sides. Those photographs were then painstakingly combined into one finished image long before modern digital editing became commonplace. The result was one of the most unusual album covers of the decade. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated the artistic vision. The biggest problem wasn't the giant ball of junk. It was the naked man. Major retailers like Walmart and Kmart looked at the artwork and immediately refused to stock the album. It wasn't exactly the kind of publicity they were hoping for, but according to the band, the retailers weren't even the biggest problem. That honor belonged to Elektra Records. Anthrax believed their label did almost nothing to support Stomp 442. They felt the promotion was minimal and marketing was weak, and when retailers began refusing to carry the album, the label didn't exactly go to war defending the band. Whether that perception was entirely fair or not, it's clear the relationship between Anthrax and Elektra had become toxic. Years later, Scott Ian would describe this period as one of the darkest chapters in the band's career. Not because of the music itself, but because everything surrounding the album seemed to work against them. Ironically, even the album title of the record perfectly captured the band's mindset. Stomp 442 wasn't just a random collection of words. Charlie Benante has always been a huge muscle car enthusiast, and 442 refers to the classic Oldsmobile 442. For those unfamiliar with classic American cars, the original designation stood for a 4-barrel carburetor, a 4-speed manual transmission, and dual exhaust. The word stomp was inspired by stomping on the accelerator. Put it all together, the title basically evokes the image of flooring the gas pedal in a roaring muscle car, and honestly, that's exactly what the album sounds like. Anthrax wanted this record to hit like a V8 engine. The problem was, the music world had changed dramatically. By 1995, metal looked very different than it had 5 or 6 years earlier. Grunge had already rewritten the rules. Alternative rock dominated the radio. Bands like Pantera were redefining heavy music. Nu metal was just around the corner. Traditional thrash bands were struggling to figure out where they fit in. Some adapted, some disappeared altogether. Anthrax chose evolution over nostalgia. Instead of trying to recreate the lightning-fast speed of Among the Living, they embraced heavier grooves, darker songwriting, and a more modern production style. Not every fan appreciated that decision. In fact, Stomp 4 for 2 became one of the most divisive albums Anthrax had ever released. Critics weren't sure what to make of it either. Some praised the record's crushing production and thought songs like Fueled proved Anthrax could still compete with anyone in heavy music. Others accused the band of chasing trends. Depending on which review you read, Anthrax were either successfully evolving or abandoning their identity. Fans were equally split. Old school thrash fans missed Dan Spitz's intricate guitar work and the band's faster, more technical style. For some people, hearing an acoustic song like Bear felt almost sacrilegious, especially coming from a band that wrote Nice Fucking Ballad 4 years prior. Others couldn't understand why Anthrax had even removed their classic logo from the album cover. To those fans, it felt like the band they loved was slowly disappearing. On the other hand, plenty of listeners loved what John Bush brought to Anthrax. His powerful, gritty voice fit the heavy direction perfectly. Many fans consider Stomp 4 for 2 one of the strongest records of the Bush era. That's the funny thing about the album. Your opinion often depends on which version of Anthrax you fell in love with first. Commercially, though, there was no denying the album underperformed. After Sound of White Noise had debuted at number 7 on the Billboard chart, expectations were understandably high. Stomp 4 for 2 peaked number 47, not a disaster by normal standards, but certainly disappointing compared to what the band had achieved just 2 years earlier. Between the lack of label support, the controversy with the artwork, changing musical tastes, the odds were stacked against Anthrax from the beginning. That alone makes it a fascinating chapter in the Anthrax story, but while Anthrax were busy reinventing themselves with John Bush, one question still remained. What happened to Joey Belladonna after leaving one of the biggest thrash bands in the world? Where did his career go? Did he disappear completely? Did he form another successful band, or did the music industry simply move on without him? That's exactly what we're going to find out in the next episode as we catch up with Joey Belladonna and explore what he was doing those first few years after leaving Anthrax. Trust me, you might be surprised where his journey took him. Till next time, thanks for watching. Check out the playlist that should be appearing on your screen right now. It is the story of Anthrax. I'm telling the story of Anthrax from the beginning, and I'm talking about some adjacent bands like Stormtroopers of Death, and the next video will have another album that's not an Anthrax album. So that's pretty cool. Check it all out. I'll be doing this, and I want to finish before the new one comes out. I'll probably finish before, but anyway, like, subscribe. See you in the next one.